use a plastic bottle. Okay, where's my Massachusetts people? Okay, well, you have to hear my story before you start swinging. Of course, you all know that the Revolutionary War began in Massachusetts, right? The massacre and the Lexington and Concord and everything. But I'm here to tell everybody that the Revolutionary War, the ideas behind it actually start here in Virginia in this house right where you all are sitting. Because this house had a very interesting meaning in it. During the French and Indian War, which was the war preceding the American Revolution, the British and the colonists are on one side against the French and the Indians. And the General-in-Chief of the British Army, his name is Edward Braddock, shows up and makes his headquarters in this house. And he decides on a conference of all the other royal governors of the colonies to show up here. And what they want to talk about in here is who's going to pay for this army out here. And so the colonists, the governors, all said, well, you're going to pay for it. It's your army, you're the British. And Braddock says, no, the British people are paying enough in taxes. We're supporting armies fighting all over the world. This time the Americans are going to have to start helping pay their fair share. And so the governors all said, well, how are we going to pay? We don't have any money. And Braddock says that he had came here with permission from Parliament that they could start levying taxes on the colonists. And so the governors all said, well, that's a great idea. And so they all run back to their colonies, and after the war, they start instituting all the taxes. So the fighting does start in Boston and Massachusetts, but the actual idea is that no taxation without representation was decided in the House here. So kind of neat that we all share that history together. And just as a little historic note before our ghost story, for every 1 cent in tax that an American paid here in the colonies, the same British person paid $1 in tax. So you can imagine why they weren't too impressed when we were screaming and yelling and running around going, you can't tax us. So. Now, this is the John Carlisle mansion, and John Carlisle is an interesting guy. He shows up in Virginia in 1749 to start a new town. And so he builds his house right here. And first of all, what do you notice different about the house than the other buildings around here? Right, it's stone. Yep. A yard, who said that? Very good, yes, the yard. Now, yards are no big deal to us in the 21st century, but in 1749 Alexandria, this is illegal. And what had happened was the town fathers got together, they passed an ordinance that there'd no longer be front yards. They wanted all the buildings up against the sidewalk because, of course, we're a royal colony of England. They want us to look more like England, more like London. Nobody has front yards in England, and so hence you'll not see any more front yards on our tour tonight. But of course, no one's going to tell the guy who started the town, hey, tear your house down, move it over to the sidewalk. So hence the house stays back here, and the yard will become important in our story in a second. Now, he does something else interesting to this house. He buries something in the house, something I'm sure none of your homes have in it. He buries a cat in the house. And the cat is right where the doorknob is, to the left of it in the wall. And how they know there's a cat in there was in the 1960s, they were fixing the house up to become a museum. They were fixing some plaster damage from some water that had gotten in, and there they found Boo Boo Kitty all the way back from 1749. Of course, Boo Boo at this point is a mummy because he's been in a wall for 260 years. Some of you are probably wondering why there's a cat in the wall, and the rest of you should be wondering that. Well, the reason John does this is that old Scottish legend says if you bury a cat in your house, it will protect your house from evil and ghosts and spirits, and it'll bring everybody good luck who resides in the house. Now, we'll fast forward in the 1840s. Man comes to town, he buys the property, and he doesn't care about living in the house. What he cares about is the front yard here because he's going to build a new hotel for the town. And the hotel stood from that building all the way to that building, from the sidewalk all the way to the steps here, and went straight up. Roof lines are equal, so if you were all standing on the sidewalk, you'd no longer be able to see the house. All you're going to see is the hotel. And in the very back room of the hotel, a catwalk connected to the house and the hotel. Remember what's buried in the house? Well, the Union soldiers are here, and they need place for their wounded hospitals, and so hotels are a pretty good place, so they take the hotel over, put their wounded troops in there, and the guy that's staying in the room right above you all with the catwalk does something really weird one night. In that he's sleeping, he all of a sudden gets up in the middle of the night, he climbs out of his window, and he's standing up at the catwalk up there. And we don't know if he slipped or fell or jumped or what happened, but he falls onto his head right here on the steps and breaks his neck. Ouch, right? Well, terrible accident could happen to anybody. Only 40 years go by, salesman comes to town, the salesman gets a room in the hotel, guess which room is that? And so for a week, he's perfectly normal going about his business. The last night he's here in town, he does something very strange in it, that he gets out of his bed, climbs out the window, and he's up at the catwalk, and they don't know if he slipped or fell or jumped, but he falls on his head on the steps here, breaks his neck, and he's lying in the same position as the first guy. And then just 10 more years go by, and a tour guide finishes his tour, comes into the hotel. He was living in the hotel at the time. This is 1912. The guy goes up to his room, and in the morning, guess where they found him? Yep, he had fallen on his head and broke his neck, and he was lying in the same position as the first two guys. So, of course, how many people have died?
3.
And how many ghosts are in the house?
3.
4.
Everybody's way too high. Everybody's still too high.
They weren't in the house.
You're up. Because remember, the cat's in there to protect the house. So the house has been around for all that time and all that death outside, but there's never been one paranormal activity inside the house, no ghost sightings, nothing. Well, in the 1960s, when they were fixing the house up to be a museum, they finally tore the old hotel down. And once they did that, that's of course when things began happening. And of course, where they began happening was right here on the steps where y'all are sitting. So if you have cameras, take pictures of this area before we leave, because a lot of people will get most of the orb activity on the tour route usually centers around this area, especially the front here. And usually the orbs show up 3 in a camera, of course, for the 3 guys who fell. And but I didn't finish the story. There's, of course, there's one more part about the cat that I didn't finish. So somebody will have to remind me to finish the story in the graveyard before I run off and leave you all. So you can take your pictures, and I'll meet you down at the snack.